On April 29, 1945, American soldiers arrive at Dachau concentration camp, attracted by some disturbing intelligence reports. Nothing they had read in the report could have prepared them for the shocking reality they found in Dachau, where they quickly learned of all the atrocities committed by Nazi guards. The Allied officers had strict orders from General Eisenhower to safely bring all the Nazi criminals to justice, instead of taking matters into their own hands. However, there was nothing against looking the other way, while the former inmates took revenge for all the killings and beatings they had endured for years. What happens when the distinction between justice and vengeance starts to fade? In the tumultuous moments following the liberation of Dachau, the camp was transformed into a battlefield as Nazi guards confronted the harsh repercussions of their heinous acts. Welcome to the Marshall Memoirs, uncovering the horrors of one of Germany's most brutal death camps. On the 29th of April 1945, during the agonic days of World War II, a series of tragic events unfolded at the Dachau concentration camp. In the aftermath of its liberation, German prisoners of war faced violent reprisals at the hands of disgusted American soldiers and vengeful camp internees, marking a dark chapter in the history of the conflict. The exact number of SS members who lost their lives in the incident remains uncertain, with most estimates suggesting a figure between 35 and 50 fatalities. In the days leading up to the camp's liberation, the SS guards executed thousands of internees, while tens of thousands more were forced into so-called death marches, where prisoners were forced to walk hundreds of miles towards the next internment camp deeper into the territory still held by the Nazis. Countless lives were lost to brutality and the cold during these painful walks. Allied soldiers' responses as they entered the death camp were a complex tapestry of shock, horror, disturbance, and anger. They were confronted with the overwhelming sight of thousands of dead bodies, while also facing the hostility of some German guards who had opened fire and resisted surrender. As the soldiers of the 42nd Division, nicknamed Rainbow, entered the Bavarian town of Dachau during the final days of World War II, their anticipation was set on discovering an empty training ground for Adolf Hitler's elite SS forces, or perhaps a prisoner of war camp. What they uncovered, however, was something completely different that would forever be etched in their minds. Mountains of gaunt corpses, numerous train cars brimming with severely decomposed human remains, and perhaps the most challenging to comprehend, the thousands of walking skeletons who had endured the atrocities of Dachau, the Nazis' earliest and longest-running concentration camp. Despite the fact that other camps had been raided since January 1945, nearly all soldiers that arrived at Dachau, from generals to privates, were largely unaware of the true nature of concentration camps. They just could not fathom the extent of the slavery, oppression, and atrocities committed by the Nazis. The liberation of Dachau by American troops in April of 1945 marked a significant moment, but it was not the first instance of deliverance by Allied forces. Actually, Dachau was the third concentration camp to be liberated by British or American Allied forces. They still did not know the extent of the horrors the Nazi camps hid. News about Auschwitz had been slowly making their way across the ranks of the American army, but most of the soldiers just could not believe they were true. Now they knew. Moving deeper into the complex, the soldiers found more bodies. Some had been dead for hours or days before the camp's capture and lay where they had died. They inspected the camp to find a row of concrete structures that contained rooms full of hundreds of naked and barely clothed dead bodies piled floor to ceiling. Additionally, they reported the existence of a coal-fired crematorium and a gas chamber. The harrowing visuals and personal accounts captured by the astonished liberators of Dachau conveyed the grim realities of the Holocaust to the American public. Dachau, from camp for political prisoners to death machine. Dachau was inaugurated in 1933, with the infamous SS leader Heinrich Himmler declaring it the first concentration camp for political prisoners. Indeed, in its early years, Dachau served as a forced labor detention camp, targeting individuals deemed enemies of the Nazi Party. Initially, this included trade unionists, communists, and democratic socialists. Over time, the camp's population expanded to include Romani gypsies, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Jews. The operation of Dachau, marked by its chilling efficiency, was primarily orchestrated by SS Commandant Theodor Eicke. He implemented a harsh doctrine of dehumanization that relied on slave labor, corporal punishment, flogging, deprivation of food, and the swift execution of those who attempted to flee. The prisoners at Dachau endured harsh conditions as they dismantled a large munitions factory from World War I, subsequently building the barracks and offices that would become the primary training site for the SS. The prisoners constructed what they referred to as a protective custody camp, a term that belied the grim reality of the concentration camp nestled within the vast Dachau complex. This area consisted of 32 dilapidated barracks encircled by an electrified barbed wire fence, a deep ditch, and 7 imposing guard towers. In a harrowing account of inhumane treatment, prisoners endured medical experiments that involved injections of lethal diseases like malaria and tuberculosis. The grim reality is underscored by the countless individuals who perished from grueling labor or torture. Their bodies were routinely incinerated in the on-site crematorium to erase all memory of their existence. Emblazoned upon the iron gate that divided the concentration camp from the surrounding area of Dachau were the mocking words Arbeit macht frei, which translate to "work sets you free." Dachau emerged as a significant achievement for the Nazis, leading to Eicke's promotion as Inspector General of all German concentration camps, with Dachau serving as the blueprint for others. Following the infamous Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, when Nazi mobs unleashed destruction upon Jewish synagogues, businesses, and homes throughout Germany, there was a significant increase in the number of Jews confined at Dachau. As the American forces prepared to liberate Dachau, the camp held 67,665 registered prisoners, with approximately one-third identifying as Jewish. On one fateful day of 1945, American soldiers led by Lieutenant Colonel Felix L. Sparks made their way towards the vast Dachau complex from the southwest. There, they discovered 39 railway boxcars filled with approximately 2,000 skeletal remains abandoned on the tracks just beyond the complex. Brain tissue lay scattered on the ground, a grim testament to the violence that had unfolded, as one victim was discovered with a crushed skull nearby. The pungent odor of decomposing bodies and human waste filled the air, while the haunting sight of gaunt, naked figures triggered visceral reactions among the approaching soldiers. Vomiting, tears, disbelief, and deep-seated anger surged within them. Advancing soldiers from Company H in the 22nd Regiment utilized a loudspeaker to urge the SS to surrender, yet their response was one of defiance. American troops found themselves under fire from machine gunners positioned in a guard tower and a nearby building. As the exploration progressed into the intricate layout, particularly within the confines designated for prisoners, an increasing number of bodies appeared. Some had succumbed to death hours and days before the camp's capture, remaining where they had breathed their last. Soldiers recounted their harrowing observations of a series of cement structures, each housing rooms filled with hundreds of naked and barely clothed corpses stacked from floor to ceiling. Among these grim sights were a coal-fired crematorium and a gas chamber, stark reminders of the atrocities witnessed. Right until the Americans found it, the commandant of the camp had been SS Principal General Martin Weiss. The previous days, Weiss, along with the camp guards and SS garrisons, had vacated the camp in anticipation of the arrival of US troops. SS Captain Heinrich Wicker, who died shortly after surrendering, was then appointed to oversee a contingent of approximately 560 personnel that were left behind. This group was mainly composed of conscripted inmates from the SS disciplinary prison, located within the Dachau concentration camp alongside Hungarian troops from the Waffen-SS. American soldiers could not believe what they found at Dachau. The surrender of Dachau was not straightforward nor peaceful. In theory, Captain Wicker would hand over control of the camp to Brigadier General Henning Linden of the 42nd Infantry Division of the US Army, but not before both sides' troops engaged in several armed skirmishes inside the compound. Heinrich Himmler anticipated the arrival of the American troops at the gates of Dachau by 2 weeks. In February of 1945, he sent a telegram to the current commandant of Dachau, Eduard Weiter, in which he warned that surrendering the camp to the enemy was unthinkable. The entire camp must be evacuated. No prisoner must fall alive into the hands of the enemy. Himmler instructed Weiter that, if necessary, he was authorized to massacre the entire camp population with gas bombs. He had instructions of killing as many Americans as possible when doing this. But Weiter disobeyed him. When the end was inevitable, Weiter gathered his administrators in his office and announced that Dachau would be handed over to the Americans through the Red Cross. He asked the SS officers to run to the clothing depot and begin dressing up as civilians and prisoners. While this scene was happening on the night of April the 28th, American General Linden was already at the gates of the main camp together with Major General Collins and several hundred armed men. Only 130 SS men carrying weapons remained inside. Some of the Nazis had snuck out, others were hiding somewhere. Others had been killed during the previous 2 days while trying to defend some of the sub-camps that composed the Dachau compound. The last of the Dachau camps was the main one, where all the Nazi higher-ups were now trying to negotiate getting out alive. Linden reported reaching the command post in the town of Dachau around 1500 hours. He then navigated across the Amper River towards the complex, roughly 500 meters south of the bridge he had crossed. When the gates of Dachau opened according to the negotiated terms, the Americans were met by Dr. Victor Maurer of the Red Cross together with an SS officer. Maurer had a white handkerchief tied to a broomstick as Linden's jeeps surrounded them both. Linden took command of the camp amid some chaos. Victor Moore stood alongside 2 SS troopers who identified themselves as the camp commander and his assistant. On the night of the 28th, they had arrived to relieve the regular camp personnel, with their mission focused on surrendering the camp to the advancing Americans. A representative from the Swiss Red Cross reported that approximately 100 SS guards were present in the camp, their weapons stacked away except for those stationed in the tower. He issued clear directives that no shots were to be fired. The task of relieving the guards would require approximately 50 men, given the presence of 42,000 inmates, many of whom were described as half-crazed and afflicted with typhus. He inquired whether he held the position of an officer, and he responded that he held the position of Assistant Division Commander of the 42nd Infantry Division, and that he was there to accept the surrender of the camp on behalf of the Rainbow Division for the United States Army. As the U.S. foot soldiers approached Dachau in late April 1945, the overwhelming odor that filled the air indicated something was profoundly amiss. Some soldiers believed they were positioned downwind from a chemical factory, while others likened the harsh odor to the nauseating scent of feathers being singed from a plucked chicken. None of their previous combat experiences equipped them for the challenges that awaited them. In the weeks leading up to the liberation, Nazi commanders at Buchenwald, another grim symbol of the Holocaust, crammed at least 3,000 prisoners into 40 train cars, seeking to conceal them from the advancing Allied forces. The train was scheduled to reach Dachau a few days later. However, a horrifying journey that extended over 3 weeks unfolded. Of the train's 3,000 passengers, all but a quarter succumbed to the grim realities of starvation, dehydration, asphyxiation, and disease. The survivors were gathered in the concentration camp while countless lifeless bodies remained abandoned on the railway cars, left to decay. This is how the American soldiers arriving at Dachau first encountered the death train. The disturbing sights and odors emanating from the death train overwhelmed numerous American soldiers, leaving them both physically sick and emotionally traumatized. Yet this was merely a glimpse of the unimaginable horrors that lay ahead within the confines of the actual camp. In the weeks preceding the liberation, the Nazis transported prisoners from various locations throughout Germany and even from Auschwitz. Similar to the survivors of the Buchenwald death train, these new arrivals faced starvation and were afflicted by diseases such as typhus. The Dachau correctional officers systematically packed the new arrivals into the already overcrowded barracks, cramming as many as 1,600 men into buildings that were initially designed to accommodate just 250. In the camp, starvation and disease ravaged the population, leading to the tragic loss of thousands of prisoners mere days before liberation arrived. The Nazis made efforts to cremate as many bodies as possible before they abandoned Dachau, yet the sheer number proved overwhelming. In a harrowing chapter of history, an additional 7,000 prisoners from Dachau, predominantly Jews, were forced onto a death march towards Tegernsee in the south. Along this grim journey, those who fell behind were met with gunfire, while countless others succumbed to the relentless toll of exhaustion, repressed anger and unleashed fury during the liberation of Dachau. As the American GIs stepped into the concentration camp, they were confronted with harrowing scenes. Heaps of lifeless bodies lay before them, their skin drawn taut over emaciated forms, a stark testament to the horrors that had unfolded. In a series of poignant interviews, the soldiers recounted the grim sight of dead bodies being stacked like cordwood, a metaphor that inadvertently stripped the fallen prisoners of their last vestiges of humanity. However, for the soldiers to perceive those bodies as entirely human at that moment would have been an overwhelming burden. Reports say that everywhere one looked, there was a chilling tableau of bodies, with individuals teetering on the brink of death or existing in a state of utter decay that overwhelmed the senses, rendering it almost impossible to comprehend. As the American soldiers of the 45th Thunderbird Division came across the death train, it marked the beginning of a haunting revelation. The soldiers of the 45th Division had endured 500 days of combat, believing they had seen every horrific act that war could unleash upon them. Amidst the chaos, a train emerged, laden with innocent souls, their eyes and mouths agape, seemingly pleading for compassion. A significant number of American soldiers were seen breaking down in tears. Intense fiery anger consumed some of the toughest fighters. As 4 German officers stepped out from the shadows of the woods, a white handkerchief raised in surrender, Lieutenant William Walsh led them into a boxcar, its interior strewn with lifeless bodies. In a swift motion, he drew his pistol and fired. As the mortally wounded Germans cried out in agony, other American soldiers moved in to complete the task at hand. Within the confines of Dachau, conditions deteriorated further. An estimated 50 to 125 SS officers and various members of the German military, including hospital personnel, were gathered in a coal yard. Walsh requested a machine gun, rifles, and a Tommy gunner. As the soldiers methodically loaded a belt of bullets into the machine gun, the German prisoners rose and started to approach their American captors. At that moment, Walsh reportedly drew his pistol and shouted, "Let them have it!" In a harrowing moment that lasted just half a minute, a barrage of gunfire erupted, resulting in the tragic loss of at least 17 German prisoners in the coal yard of Dachau. At the forefront of the traumatizing experiences faced by the liberators at Dachau was the encounter with the surviving prisoners, who numbered approximately 32,000. Their condition was best characterized as that of walking skeletons, a stark reflection of extreme malnourishment and illness. Afflicted by typhus and lice, the exhausted prisoners reached out to their liberators, unable to comprehend that their harrowing journey had come to an end. Unprepared and unaware of the proper care for individuals suffering from severe starvation, the soldiers retrieved their rations and Hershey bars, offering all they had to the emaciated prisoners, who devoured the food with desperation. In a heartbreaking turn of events, their digestive systems were unable to process solid food, and many died because of this. Years later, many of these soldiers grappled with a profound sense of guilt as they reflected on the initial horror they experienced upon encountering the prisoners, followed by remorse for their actions in overfeeding them. They felt they were extinguishing their spirits with an abundance of kindness. The weight of guilt grew heavier as American soldiers found themselves unable to allow the liberated prisoners to depart from Dachau indeed. Initially, they required extensive care to regain their health, a process that would span several months. Following this, a suitable place for them to reside would be essential. In a heartbreaking turn of events, numerous Jewish prisoners freed from Dachau found themselves enduring prolonged stays in displaced persons camps, often for years before they were granted the opportunity to emigrate to countries such as the United States, the UK, and Palestine. War must go on, American soldiers after witnessing horrors unimaginable. Many of the American soldiers who played a role in the liberation of Dachau remained for just a brief period before continuing to other assignments. The responsibility for the survivors fell to combat medical units, as teams of engineers took on the solemn task of burying the deceased and restoring order to the camp. The news of the events that transpired at locations such as Dachau and Buchenwald circulated rapidly among the Allied forces. In the days and weeks after liberation, numerous soldiers and officers visited the concentration camps to witness firsthand the horrific acts committed by the Nazis. In the final days of World War II, Adolf Hitler took his own life just one day after the liberation of Dachau, as the certainty of Germany's defeat loomed large. For numerous soldiers, witnessing the horrors of Dachau firsthand transformed their understanding of the war, imbuing it with a profound significance that would resonate long after the conflict ended. They were engaged in a battle not merely against an adversary, but against the very essence of evil. On April 12, 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, accompanied by Generals George Patton and Omar Bradley, made a significant visit to the Ohrdruf concentration camp just 1 week following its liberation. It seemed that Eisenhower had an awareness that the horrific events of the Holocaust would eventually be downplayed as mere exaggerations or outright denied. Eisenhower claimed that the sights he encountered were beyond words. He described the compelling imagery and the haunting accounts of starvation, cruelty, and brutality as so intense that they left him feeling somewhat unwell. He explains that he undertook the visit intending to gather first-hand evidence of these matters in case there arose in the future a tendency to dismiss these allegations as mere propaganda. General of the Army Dwight D. Eisenhower issued a communiqué regarding the capture of the Dachau concentration camp. He reported that their forces had liberated and mopped up the infamous concentration camp at Dachau, where approximately 32,000 prisoners were liberated, and 300 SS camp guards were quickly neutralized. The memorandum was short and to the point, devoid of any emotion, and thus unable to really transmit what was happening at Dachau. Americans arrived at Dachau on a Sunday. On Wednesday, operations in the camp came to a halt, as plans for evacuation were set in motion. A transport carrying 4,000 prisoners managed to escape, yet the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions traversed the 40 miles from the Danube more swiftly than the Germans had anticipated. As the clock struck noon on Sunday, a stillness enveloped the camp. The SS guards stood vigilant in their towers, maintaining their watch, when suddenly a shout pierced the air. "Americans!" A prisoner sprinted towards the gate, only to be met with the sharp crack of a guard's gunfire. In the open air, a solitary American soldier gazed nonchalantly at the towering structures while the guards observed him, and a few others positioned 200 or 300 yards away. As the Americans unleashed their fire, the guards stationed in the gate tower descended, their hands raised in surrender. One individual concealed a pistol behind his back, and in that moment the first American fired upon him. A jeep approached, carrying a blonde female war correspondent alongside a chaplain, their presence marking a significant moment in the unfolding narrative. The chaplain stood before the gathered prisoners, who were now pressing towards the gate, inviting them to unite in reciting the Lord's Prayer. On the afternoon of April 29th, the troops of the 42nd and 45th Divisions achieved a significant milestone by liberating Dachau. The very next morning they found themselves engaged in combat in Munich. By nightfall, alongside the other 3 divisions of the 15th Corps, they had successfully captured the city, which held the distinction of being Bavaria's capital and the birthplace of Nazism. War was almost over. Taking matters into their own hands, bloodbath of Nazi prisoners. It would take years for American soldiers to erase from their minds the horrible scenes they witnessed at Dachau. Lieutenant Colonel Felix L. Sparks, serving as the battalion commander of the 157th Infantry Regiment within the 45th Infantry Division of the 7th United States Army, documented a fateful incident that occurred the very day of Dachau's liberation. Sparks observed the scene as approximately 50 German prisoners, taken by the 157th Infantry Regiment, were herded into a space previously designated for coal storage. The region featured a partially enclosed space defined by an L-shaped masonry wall, standing approximately 8 feet tall, adjacent to a hospital. A machine gun team from Company Y stood vigilant, overseeing the German prisoners of war. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks departed from those men, making his way to the heart of the camp, where SS soldiers remained unyielding. After covering only a brief distance, a soldier's voice pierced the air, shouting, "They're trying to get away!" Almost immediately, the sharp crack of machine gun fire erupted from the vicinity he had just vacated. He dashed back and delivered a kick to a 19-year-old soldier known as Bird Eye, who was operating the machine gun and had already taken the lives of approximately 12 prisoners, injuring several others in the process. The gunner, overwhelmed with emotion, recounted the harrowing moment when the prisoners attempted to flee. Sparks expressed skepticism about the narrative. He assigned a non-commissioned officer to the weapon before continuing his trek toward the heart of the camp. Sparks further stated that the incident in question had sparked a flurry of sensational claims across numerous publications, suggesting that a significant number, if not all, of the German prisoners taken at Dachau were executed. The reality is quite the opposite. On that day, the total number of German guards killed at Dachau likely did not surpass 50, with 30 likely representing a more precise estimate. On that date, the regimental records reveal that more than 1,000 German prisoners were transported to the regimental collecting point. As the task force spearheaded the regimental assault, it became evident that nearly all the prisoners were captured by this unit, encompassing several hundred individuals from Dachau. In the investigation that ensued, led by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whittaker, an account was provided by Howard Buchner, a first lieutenant in the United States Army and medical officer with the 3rd Battalion of the 157th Infantry. This account, delivered to Whittaker on May 5, 1945, aligned with the Sparks account without contradiction. Buchner provided sworn testimony stating that at approximately 1600, he arrived in the yard where the German soldiers had been shot. He recounted observing 15 or 16 dead and wounded German soldiers lying along the wall. He observed that some injured soldiers were still in motion, yet refrained from examining them. He was uncertain whether any medical assistance had been requested for the injured. Buchner wrote a book in 1986 titled Dachau, The Hour of the Avenger, an eyewitness account where he reveals that American forces were responsible for the deaths of at least 520 German prisoners of war. Among them, 346 were reportedly killed under the orders of First Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead during an alleged mass execution that took place in the coal yard just hours following the initial hospital shooting. However, Buchner did not observe the purported event, and in his sworn statement he only recalled having seen 15 or 16 dead Germans, not 346 as he wrote later. In the official investigation report, his sworn testimony notably lacked any reference to a second shooting, which was largely documented at the time. Buchner's inaccuracies and arbitrary use of figures in recounting the false narrative regarding the complete liquidation of all SS troops at Dachau were readily embraced by revisionist organizations who manipulated this information to support their skewed interpretations of the events at Dachau. Reports of mistreatment of Nazi prisoners of war in Dachau. Some of the most important documents for understanding what happened during the first days of the liberation of Dachau are the letters that American soldiers sent home. Captain David Wilsey, an American doctor, detailed the reprisals he witnessed, addressing his wife Emily with heartfelt sincerity. Wilsey expressed that he experienced no emotional disturbance while observing the killings of the Nazis, whom he regarded as beasts deserving of slaughter. Wilsey expressed that the Nazi guards truly deserved what they faced. According to Wilsey, the initial actions of the liberated prisoners were directed towards the Nazi dog handlers and their dogs, who had ruthlessly taken the lives of numerous inmates. Wilsey recounted his experiences with the SS soldiers, detailing how he subjected them to icy cold water while they stood at attention for long periods just before the liberators arrived to execute them. Another witness, Abram Sakar, reported that several Nazis were captured and executed without trial, alongside the guard dogs that served them. Jürgen Zaruski reports that 16 SS men were executed in the coal yard, as is well documented. But he also mentions 17 Nazis meeting their fate in Tower B, and he claims that additional casualties occurred at the hands of American soldiers during the incident. Between a handful and as many as 25 or 50 additional individuals lost their lives at the hands of inmates. Zaruski's research draws upon the comprehensive interrogation records found in the official investigation report from May 1945, which became publicly available in 1992, alongside a collection of documents gathered by General Henning Linden's son. U.S. Army photographers including Paul Averitt, George Gabelavage, Sidney Rachlin, and Ed Royce captured the documentation of the Dachau liberation reprisals. Walenty Lenarchik, a former inmate of Dachau, recounted the moment of liberation. He reported that prisoners surged over the wire, lifting the Americans onto their shoulders while others apprehended the SS men. The initial SS officer pushed aside a couple of prisoners, yet the bravery of the inmates surged. They retaliated, bringing the assailants to the ground, and it became unclear whether they were trampled or met a more fatal end, but it was evident that lives were lost. In another part of the camp, SS men, capos and informers faced brutal violence, their bodies subjected to relentless blows from fists, sticks and shovels. In a notable incident, American troops observed 2 prisoners brutally assaulting a German guard, using a shovel as their weapon of choice. Lieutenant Bill Walsh was present to witness this harrowing event unfold. A soldier observed an inmate relentlessly stomping on an SS trooper's face, leaving it in a state of utter devastation. As the soldier confronted him, pointing out that he must have much hate in his heart, the prisoner only responded with a silent nod. An American chaplain received a harrowing account from 3 young Jewish men who had escaped the camp during liberation. They recounted how they had confronted one of the more sadistic SS guards, finding him concealed in a barn and disguised as a peasant, and subsequently beaten him to death. Following the emergence of witness testimonies regarding the killings, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker, serving as the Assistant Inspector General of the 7th Army, received orders to investigate. On June 8, 1945, a report was issued titled Investigation of Alleged Mistreatment of German Guards at Dachau, commonly referred to as the IG report. In 1991, a significant discovery was made when an archived copy was located in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., subsequently being made public for all to see. Whitaker documented an incident near the back entrance of the camp where Lieutenant William P. Walsh, the commander of Company 1, shot 4 German soldiers who had surrendered to him inside a boxcar. Private Albert C. Pruitt ascended into the boxcar, where he delivered a final act of mercy to the wounded men. Upon entering the camp, Walsh, together with Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead, the executive officer of Company I, took charge of the process of segregating the prisoners of war into 2 distinct groups, those affiliated with the Wehrmacht and those belonging to the SS. The SS was led into a designated area where they faced execution at the hands of the I Company, utilizing a variety of weaponry. The inquiry led the US military to contemplate courts-martial for those implicated, notably the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks. Additionally, Lieutenant Howard Buchner was mentioned in the report for failing to provide medical assistance to the wounded SS men in the coal yard, which was deemed a dereliction of duty. In a decisive move, General George S. Patton, who had recently taken on the role of military governor of Bavaria, opted to dismiss the charges brought against him. As a result, the individuals who observed the killings did not undergo cross-examination in a courtroom setting. Useless efforts to prevent violence against Nazis. In late 1945, Colonel Charles L. Decker, serving as an acting deputy judge advocate, reached a conclusion regarding the situation. He acknowledged that there had likely been a breach of international law. However, he expressed the view that given the circumstances faced by the first combat troops, it was not deemed just or equitable to pursue the challenging and potentially unfeasible task of assigning individual responsibility at that time. It was decided that the horrible sights inside the camp and the cruelty exerted by the Nazis justified profound emotional reaction and sometimes violence. Numerous SS guards who played a role in the camp's horrific acts were apprehended at the scene. In the chaos of the situation, individual American soldiers took it upon themselves to execute these guards on the spot, acting without directives from their superiors. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, a witness to the events, attempted to intervene and halt the killings. However, the intense emotions and turmoil surrounding the situation propelled it into a cycle of violence. Amidst the chaos, both soldiers and liberated prisoners found themselves engulfed by the sheer brutality they had observed, leading them to partake in these acts of reprisal. This event emerged as a complex moral dilemma, justifiable yet prohibited by the laws of war. As the situation stabilized, the attention of American forces turned to addressing the urgent requirements of the freed prisoners. The focus was on relief efforts, prioritizing medical care and the provision of food. Simultaneously, American forces initiated the process of meticulously recording the crimes perpetrated at Dachau, fully aware of the significance of preserving evidence of Nazi atrocities for the sake of historical record and the pursuit of justice. Nevertheless, the executions of the SS guards could not be concealed. As reports began to emerge, whispers of the events that had unfolded spread through military and civilian communities, prompting an investigation. The reprisals at Dachau have sparked moral debates that have persisted for decades. Some contend that the actions of American soldiers were not only justified, but also comprehensible, considering the immense horrors they had just encountered. The harrowing image of the deceased, the gravely injured, and the anguished captives challenged the resolve of many soldiers, making it difficult for them to hold their composure. Some argue that the summary executions, although possibly fueled by strong emotions, contravened the very principles for which the Allies were engaged in battle. The Allies sought to set themselves apart from the Nazis by upholding justice, adhering to the rule of law, and championing democratic ideals. Executing prisoners without trial posed a significant threat to the integrity of those values. The ongoing struggle between justice and revenge emerges as a significant theme in the discourse surrounding war, especially in the context of addressing crimes against humanity. The emotional toll soldiers face as they confront such profound evil prompts a deeper inquiry into the boundaries of acceptable conduct in the most extreme situations. In the aftermath of World War II, the reprisals at Dachau gradually receded from public consciousness, eclipsed by the vast scale of Nazi atrocities and the Holocaust as a whole. The narrative of historical discourse shifted towards the significant war crimes trials held at Nuremberg, highlighting the extensive endeavor to deliver justice to the countless victims affected. The events at Dachau remain etched in collective memory, frequently surfacing in conversations surrounding wartime ethics and the conduct of military operations. Among the survivors of Dachau, the responses to the executions were diverse. Some individuals grasped and even endorsed the soldiers' actions, perceiving it as a manifestation of justice for the inhumanity they had endured. Some believed a more practical approach to justice would have involved legal avenues, emphasizing a system that promotes accountability instead of vengeance. The reprisals are a compelling example of military ethics, frequently examined through the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions. Their narrative highlights the profound difficulties in upholding discipline and legal standards amidst unimaginable atrocities. The executions at Dachau illustrate the profound challenges soldiers encounter when faced with moral dilemmas in the heat of the moment, where emotional responses frequently take precedence over legal boundaries. The Dachau reprisals stand as a morally complex chapter in the narrative of World War II, marked by the absence of legal repercussions for the soldiers involved. This serves as a poignant reminder that in the struggle against tyranny and genocide, upholding the rule of law is essential for achieving justice rather than succumbing to vengeance.